Pins on the internet story, but I also love Christina's concept of whiplash workshops. I'm going to introduce the concept of whiplash workshops in order to get the flow of exciting ideas. The first contributor was complaining that she was at work in the UK House of Lords at 2:30 this morning. But that's nothing. I was in Edinburgh, Scotland at 2:30 this morning. So we share the burdens of activism in our various jurisdictions. But Baroness JENKIN set up over 10 years ago a Women in Politics group with the now Prime Minister of the UK, Theresa May, and has been an advocate of advancing the cause of women in the political structures and processes for a long, long time. She once tried to persuade me to enter a charity swimming competition in the House of Commons, but I declined. So let's hear her contribution this morning.
Thank you. That comment came in response to Quintin's tweet earlier that he hoped this session would be lively, and I said that I'm not quite in a position to be lively since I was sitting at work at 2:30, but I'm going to start by being a bit provocative, which is to say that the gender balance in this room is the usual one that I face every day. Actually not quite so bad down that. So I guess this is the moment where the men are all going to start fiddling on their phones and say, oh, here comes the women's session. But so that's my lively bit, by the way. Now what I'm going to say may sound a little bit, and I didn't really prepare exactly what I'm supposed to be talking to, but a little bit parochial. But I think it's, I've been asked to talk about the situation in the UK, so I do that. And I start with a little snapshot of where we are and where power lies in the UK today. So we have, at this minute, a female monarch, Prime Minister, Home Secretary, both leaders of both Houses of Parliament, First Minister for Scotland, President of the Supreme Court, head of here in London, head of the Fire Service, head of the Metropolitan Police, and a First Bishop of London, which is a pretty good list. But it's fragile, and all of those gains could be lost in a minute. So it's a pleasure to speak to you in what has been quite a busy period for us in the UK on women's matters. We've just celebrated the centenary of the Representation of the People Act, which led to the first women voters, and in fact that act was very much, my great-grandfather was very instrumental in that act. He was the MP that actually proposed the amendment that was finally accepted, and he lived to see his daughter, my grandmother, take her seat in 1937 as the 33rd ever woman MP. So today, and of course we've also had International Women's Day last week, but so today we, since that Representation of the People Act 100 years ago, we have in the UK elected, over that period, since 1918, 489 women MPs in total, compared to 4,503 men. Now this is actually not as bad figures as many other countries. We don't do it particularly well in this country. We're about in the middle. No country does women in politics well unless they have quotas. We've currently got more female members of Parliament than ever before. That's 32%. And as a result of the general election we had in June, which was extremely disappointing for my party across the board, but particularly for women, the Labour Party have 45%. We and the Conservatives are stuck at 21%. That's 1 in 5. Not good enough, but better than it was when I founded Women to Win, as Quintin said, with Theresa May in 2005, when we were stuck at 19 Conservative women MPs, and today we have 67. I expected to do much better at the election, but we didn't. So we've crept upwards, and with Parliament at 32%, as I say, it's better than ever before. And that's about mid-rank globally. The campaigns that now help us to drive more women into politics, which are new and very, very helpful, there's the 50-50 Parliament group, which is very active in going out and campaigning to shake the system up a bit. And as I say, that's really directed at my own party, which has not been doing well. There's the Fawcett Society, which has been campaigning on these issues for a very long time. And critical friends like those are really important to be pushing us to having a better strategy to increase the numbers. The Women's Equality Party, which is new, is also very helpful. They're never going to get elected, but and I have to say that the Labour Party are more fearful of them than we are. So I hold them close and like them very much, actually, because women are better at working collaboratively, I think, in these places than sometimes the men are. There's a thing called the Parliament Project, which runs workshops around the country and goes to places that are very difficult for us politically. And my own campaign, as I say, Women to Win, which is designed to get more Conservative women in. So, as I said, we've done well, but we could do considerably better. Our pipeline remains very poor. And to give you an idea, before we go through our quality control process, which is called the Parliamentary Assessment Board, we run a thing called the Forum, which is when they're told about the job and they have a candidate and an MP and various people talking to them. Well, one after the election had 49 men, 1 woman come to that. So there is a new campaign, which is a hashtag Ask Her to Stand, which is also very helpful. Because I think women do need to be asked in a way that men know at 7 that they're going to be a great MP. On the whole, women want to wait, and then they'll say, oh no, not really me, and I've just saved my playground or campaigned to keep the bus stop open or whatever it might be, but that actually qualifies them to be just as good as the men. So Ask Her to Stand is beginning to make a little bit of a difference. So why else is it that women won't step up and don't step up? And I think a combination of things, certainly the social media that we've just been talking about, and I'm really glad I was here for the previous session because I've learnt a certain amount in that. The murder of the Labour MP Jo Cox, so anybody from the UK will certainly be aware of that, just about 18 months ago, I think has had a massive deterrent effect, unfortunately. And it has been proven that the social media attacks have been disproportionately hit women, as we know. So even today people will say to me, why does it matter whether it is, as we are, 20%, whether the Labour Party 45%, whether 32% is good enough? Well, it matters, ladies and gentlemen, because women's life experiences are different to men. They are not superior, they're not inferior, but they are different, and we do have to have that difference better reflected in Parliament. And I end just by saying, as I do at every event I speak at, and unfortunately there aren't enough women from probably UK-based women anyway, but to say, if you think that you might have what it takes, if you're resilient, and you've got stamina, and you've got a passion, please come and see me afterwards. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Anne, for setting the scene in this jurisdiction. I'll be talking tomorrow in my panel on polarisation of politics in Northern Ireland, where I come from, where the 3 leading polarised parties are all led by women, so the features cut across a lot of dimensions. Now we're going to fly to the west coast of the USA and hear from GAIL on some of her campaigns and the vote-winning strategies. GAIL, you're very welcome.
Good afternoon, I guess it is. So there was a point after the 2016 election when I thought maybe I better give up my political consulting badges or whatever we may have. Because as you probably all know in this room, as you get closer to election, you hear from your Aunt Edie that you haven't heard from in two to 4 years, and you hear from your cousins, and you hear from just random people who know what you do, and they want to feel safe in that they know who's going to win the election. And of course, there was not a bone in my body that believed that Donald Trump would win the election. And the question is, has the Trump presidency had an impact on women in politics. The really ironic and kind of interesting thing is that during the 2016 election, one of the surprises was that Trump was elected by white women. His positions on abortion, paid family leave, and the allegations of sexual misconduct would lead you to believe that white women would not vote for him. But they did. 61% of white women without a college degree backed President Trump. Things have changed in the US, and I'm going to address why I think that's happened. But I just want to bring this out first, that in April, 47% of women approved of Trump. Now the approval rating is 37% among college-educated white women. And now it's down to 27% in total. Clearly, Trump's position on key women's issues and the allegations of his own sexual misconduct is fueling the rise in women activism, especially in the Democratic women running for office. The tremendous women's marches right after the Trump inauguration and a year later have given women in the US and around the world the realization that I think that they have a voice, and that voice is amplified to the world when women work together. Also, the women involved in the marches, I think they all look like us. They're young and old, black, brown, white, every color you can imagine. So as we're watching these tremendous number of women marching, you just have to be able to identify at some level. This is really simple. They gave me red and green. There is a tremendous increase in women running for office. That is a quote from Emily's List, and I think most people, even in this room, recognize that Emily's List is a Democratic organization in the states that promote and have since 2000 women running for office. They promote, they fundraise, they train, they do all that. And what Emily's List is pointing out is that at this point in the 2016 cycle, about 920 women had reached out to Emily's List saying they were interested in running for office. And right now there are over 30,000 women who have raised their hand, and it's unprecedented. The figure comprises more than just 2,018 candidates. However, we think that some women are interested in running in the future or working on campaigns, and I think that's pretty significant. So let me just show you a couple of graphs that demonstrate the numbers. So 431 so far women are running for House seats. And listen to the numbers: 339 Democrats and 92 Republicans. 50 women are running for the Senate, 29 Democrats and 21 Republicans. And then that's double what of those that ran in 2016. And in the governor's race, it's a little closer, but we have 51 Democrats running in governor's seats and 31 Republicans. So why did this happen? Well, women are fired up about Donald Trump, to say the least. Almost by telepathy, women were saying, we've got to fix this. No, we are going to fix this. 3/4 of the women running are Democrats. Trump's election and inauguration kicked off a nationwide movement among Democratic women. Women took to the streets by millions in January 2017, some wearing pussy hats in reference to the infamous 2005 Access Hollywood tape in which Trump bragged about his sexual assault. Since his election, Trump continues to pour gas on the fire of Democratic women's dislike for his positions. Everything from policies on healthcare and immigration to scandals like the former White House staff secretary Rob Porter's resignation and the allegations of domestic abuse. Sorry. I just put those numbers up again in terms of what his polling numbers are. Women are frustrated that the issues they really care about are not being addressed. What are those issues? Healthcare, immigration, and DACA. The Equal Pay Act, tax bill that favors billionaires at the expense of working families, and the sexual misconduct allegations against the president himself by more than a dozen women. The Me Too movement has also given voice to women against sexual misconduct and harassment in the workplace. Women are starting to understand and believe that the gender gap contributes to sexual misconduct in politics and business in every walk of life. Thus, the women's movement, thus the surprising number of women running for office. Is it a wave or a sea change? Will there be an advantage, was the other question, for Democrats over Republicans in the midterms? Let me just give you 2 or 3 examples. So Roy Moore lost to Doug Jones in Alabama red district. In Texas, 50% of the number of women running for Congress in every single seat who ran in the primary survived. In Pennsylvania, today is the election. The Republicans are playing for high stakes in a district carried by Trump by 20 points in 2016. It is very close, and the Republicans could win by a small margin, and Democrats could also win. Either scenario will cause Republicans anxiety about the midterm elections. The one thing we wonder is are Republicans' enthusiasm for running dampened by the continued Trump drama? I think that's something we all have to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gail, for giving us lots of evidence and some analysis there. Finally, Denise Barron from RBI Strategies, Denver, Colorado based. Come and talk to us, Denise. You're welcome.
Hello, as he mentioned, I work with a firm in Denver, Colorado. I'm actually based here in the UK. And so I took together the experiences that I have in the US and in British politics to produce this analysis. But perhaps even more importantly, I took my experiences as a campaign strategist, as someone who oversees a lot of analytics and polling, and then lastly, as someone who does a lot of academic research in political psychology to put together this diagnosis of how we're currently using gender in campaign strategy in both a productive and unproductive way. So the key points that I'm going to highlight, I picked 3, not only because that's the magic number of human memory, but also because I wanted to highlight 1 problem and 2 solutions. So one thing is that there's a problem with using gender in prediction. We'll talk a little bit about targeting in that area. There's a problem, but there's potential with using gender in terms of persuasion in your campaign strategy. And lastly, I'm just going to mention a potentially better measure for gender. So first of all, the problem with prediction. When you were talking about gender, we're talking about basically just 2 groups in the entire population. It's half and half, essentially, even a little bit more skewed towards the female side when it comes to the population numbers, and often voter turnout in certain countries. And when we're looking at these 2 different groups that are just make up all of society, there's in fact more variation within each group than there is between them. So there's more, women in general have more not in common with each other than they do in terms of having anything distinctly different from men, if that makes sense. So what I mean by that is that it's a binary variable. It's 0 or 1. We don't have a lot of granularity when you're just using gender to make political predictions. So it produces this oversimplified target. I mean, I won't make anyone raise their hand, but mentally take a note if you've been in a meeting before where people have said our target universe is women. You literally could not have a less targeted universe if you say our target universe is women. So what I would say from this, I'm going to go through a little bit more on this, but I'd sort of challenge all of us as political strategists to reverse our strategic frames when we're talking about targeting women. Use it in terms of men. Our target universe is men. I mean, how ridiculous does that sound? So just to give you a little bit of a sense of what I mean by the reduction of granularity when you're looking at voting populations through just a gendered lens. This is the breakdown of the British electorate from the 2017 general election last year. And as you can see, the electorate is essentially the same whether or not you're looking at the male voters or the female voters. There's a little bit of a skew towards Labour within female voters, but it's not massive, and especially when you're looking at the other parties, it's not statistically significant that a male voter or female voter was defined by their gender and how they were making their voting decision in 2017. If you compare that to just one other variable that adds a little bit more detail and texture in terms of age, you see a massive split to where the Conservatives did much better with older population, Labour did much better with younger population, Lib Dems did about the same with everybody. And so just flipping between these really quickly shows you the problem of just basing strategy, predictions, modeling on gender. Now that being said, a lot of people don't base their predictions, their actual modeling. There was a question earlier today about updating different predictive models during a campaign. Obviously, gender is going to be thrown into that model at the very beginning, as it should be, but it is consistently, what any statistician, you can be told, it's not a significant variable in these really complicated models. So again, just to emphasize this problem, since that's the key point of my presentation, there's more variation within the groups than there are between the groups. It's a binary variable. It lacks granularity. It lacks some dimension to actually give you more information in your strategy. It produces oversimplified targets. Women are not a target universe. They're half the population. And lastly, and most importantly in my mind, in terms of producing modeling and being more targeted in our campaign approaches, gender is not the defining variable that we should be using. Instead, there's other factors that are more predictive, such as psychological factors, some demographic ones, different interactions, that geographic variables. The list goes on and on. So, that being said, obviously, gender is a massively important thing, not only in society, but especially in politics, and above that, in political campaigning and strategy. So what do we do with that majorly important factor? I would say that there's more proof that there's potential to use gender in a persuasive strategy. So instead of prediction, look at persuasion. And what I mean by that is that the messenger, the person who is speaking to the voters, is a key variable in actually being able to change someone's mind. So one of my colleagues, who's a political scientist at King's College London, did an experiment during the Alabama special election. And what their experiment showed was that when they had female canvassers go talk to female Republican women, who actually broadly define Republican women, they were more likely to both vote for Roy Moore and to have a higher salience of women's issues, the way that they define them, after speaking with this female Democratic volunteer. That says that not only does the messenger matter in terms of the leaders that Baroness JENKIN mentioned, or the candidates and the activists that were also mentioned, it matters in terms of the canvasser who is speaking to someone. So what we can do is basically implement a strategy where we're elevating women's voices to increase the salience of certain issues and to turn out women for the candidate that we're campaigning for. I already said those things. The other place that I think that there's a lot of potential in terms of using gender in political campaigning is by defining gender in a more nuanced way. So there's been a somewhat recent study that highlighted measuring gender by self-identification as male or female. This not only captures transgender population, which frankly is a small percentage of the population that still exists, it also captures the more dynamic way that we identify as masculine or feminine. If we've gotten to a point generally as a society that we recognize that male-female is more applying to sex than it is gender, and gender is a much more complicated identity, then let's measure it. So then when we measure it, we can actually make some predictions off of this. So this study specifically showed that people who identify as entirely 100% male or female on either end of the spectrum behaved more similarly to each other in political attitudes than the people in the middle of that spectrum. So that's a great example of where you're using gender to understand the electorate in a more granular, a more insightful, and a more defined way. So lastly, just to go back to the 3 points that I'm trying to really bang on about, gender is not the best variable for predicting voting behavior. It's not the best variable for predicting political attitudes, and can lead to oversimplification of voters. But rather, there's a potential in elevating women's voices in campaigning, and that can help mobilize and persuade female voters. Lastly, if we understand that gender is a little bit more complicated than just sex, then we need to figure out how to measure that and use that in our predictive models and also our campaign strategy. Thank you.
Thanks, the whiplash is now over. Thank you to the 3 contributors, that was fantastic, lots of stuff there. We've got about 10 minutes for discussion and can be a little bit more reflective before lunch. So who's going to kick us off this afternoon? Yes, sir, at the back, microphone is coming to you.
Denise, your figures are really, really interesting. Could you elaborate a little bit more on your last graph, especially on your last point, and maybe add whether race plays an issue in that as well?
So the measure that the women used, I actually don't think it's the best way to measure gender, but basically what they did is they asked survey respondents to put themselves on a spectrum from male to female, and then they just graphed that out in terms of a frequency graph from 0 to 100. There are some problems with that because they're using sex terms in terms of male, female, and so that might have skewed their data. If they used masculine, feminine, that might have been a better way to actually capture the gender differences or granularity of people. That being said, the thing that I think is really kind of groundbreaking in their study is that they were able to define different cohorts, different groups within the gender identification that didn't just map onto men and women, and then actually had more of a predictive ability on what their attitudes and ultimate voting behavior was. So I think that in terms of future studies, we should be doing something that is asking people to define themselves on a spectrum from masculine to feminine, and then also figuring out new nuanced ways, perhaps more implicit measures of what someone's gender identity is. That's going to give us more information that then you chuck into your predictive model and gets you a more precise prediction of how someone actually is going to vote, which is a big goal of all of ours, I think. You had a second part of that question. I don't know if I answered it. Oh, of course, yeah. So I mean, the point that was brought up about how white women generally voted for Trump and then women of color generally voted for Clinton is a perfect illustration of how all of these different demographic experiences contribute to different attitudes. Those different attitudes contribute to different political attitudes and behaviors. And so taking into account race, class, gender, age, all of the different demographic factors, that just adds more granularity and more information. Your model's never gonna be hurt by adding another dimension of someone's experience, basically.
Great. Can I ask Anne and Gail, in terms of campaigning, how that sort of analysis will help? Because Anne, you talked about the results of the campaigning and the numbers, which was helpful, but when you're out on the doorsteps, how do you differentiate the messages?
I don't think we do that at all well, certainly in the Conservative Party. I mean, the graph which showed the age being the really relevant thing here was interesting to me. I mean, the point is that, as you pointed out, that exactly the same number of men and women voted for the parties across the board, but the biggest swing group between 15 and 17 were younger women, who I think spun something like 17% in that 2-year period, and that's clearly where my party needs to be focusing its messaging, but it clearly isn't. And I mean, one of my, in fact, I sent a tweet to the party chairman last week saying, at Brandon Lewis, are you listening in capital letters? Because I don't think they are. So I hope that by the time we get to the next election, they won't just be leaving it to me and hoping that we're going to solve the problem for them, because this has to be a very, very concerted effort. And it's the same for the pond in which I'm fishing for candidates. The Labour Party have, it's not sort of relevant to your question, but I wanted to make the point anyway. It's easier for the Labour Party because they have trade unions. They have an enormous membership, obviously, to start with, you know, whatever it is, 500,000. Yes, have the trade unions, they have the public sector, and we have to go to, you know, to tap people on the shoulder. I mean, one of the new MPs that got elected in June was because I met her at the theatre 4 years ago, and I don't get to the theatre very often. You just have to. Actually, it was her birthday yesterday. And by the way, that's another thing. She came in. She was 50 yesterday. She was elected in June, and it's a fantastic second career for those. I'm selling it around the room, but so like catching people at the right moment. But anyway, I gave her a theatre ticket, theatre vouchers, and I said, you know what you've got to do with these. Go and find some more. So yeah, I mean, you've illustrated exactly what the problem is, but I'm not sure all the political parties are listening. Or
Yeah.
mine anyway.
Yeah, thank you. I think in my research, I did come to the realization, for most political scientists, they believe that women are going to tend to vote party lines as opposed to just for women. But I think when we're looking at the midterm elections in the US, the question I asked, is this a wave or is it a sea change, is really relevant, because if Democratic women are much more motivated to come out and vote, then that's what's going to cause the change. And otherwise, if the same amount of Democrat and Republican women come out and vote, then you have to throw it back into your hypothesis.
Sure.
So back to Baroness Jenkin's point about women running for office. One thing I saw recently from a research project on party members here in the UK showed just a really basic thing, that basically 2/3 of party members in the UK are men. Only 1/3 of actual members of political parties here are women. And when you think about the actual pool of people that are, the pool of people where the candidates come from, it's disproportionately men. So I think if parties want to have a real impact, if they want to do something more about having candidates that represent the electorate better, they need to recruit more members who represent the electorate better. It starts at that lower level of democratic engagement. Between voter and running for office, you need members that reflect it as well.
Can I just add something to that? Because the real importance for that is that those are the people who select the candidates. And if it's still 2/3 men, and disproportionately all white men, when, you know, I'm battering against a very difficult door to open. So, I mean, I completely agree, but it's not a very appealing prospect if you want to join a political party.
Okay, any comments or questions from the floor? This end of the room is obscured by this podium, so don't feel neglected. Okay, can I ask the panel then about prospects? What are the prospects for women in UK public life and politics in the next 5 years?
Well, I think we've got to build on success. I mean, look, I can't tell you how disappointed I was by the election. We had 70 women. We went into the election with 70 Conservative women. We had 30 women in good target seats. All the polls showed that we would win, if not all, at least most of them. I'm like, okay, so we get to 100 next time, we have a 50 or 60 old white men retiring, get half of them, job done, I can retire. That's why I could hardly bear to crawl out from under the duvet after the election. So, you know, got to pick yourself up and start again. So this is, I mean, so the Labour Party have already selected in their target seats, again, 60% women, I think maybe even more. So I think across the board, I mean, all these campaign groups I talked about are now focusing on us. And the trouble is because my party won't accept quotas or any form of positive action. we're slightly stuck unless they're prepared to do something means, which we did at the general election. I mean, half of our retirement seats went to women by giving them very little choice. But whether we'll get away with that next time, I don't know. Quintin, I'm an optimistic person, but I see a few dead ends ahead of us.
Gail?
I'm sorry, I don't know too much about the UK.
No, tell us about the States.
Oh, the States. I'm very optimistic. I think the women's movement has shocked us. The amount of women coming out saying they want to run. And the fact that they want to run because of the issues. And I think that's a really solid reason that isn't going to go away. I don't know what will happen, Democrat versus Republican. There's some feeling amongst US women that we should be encouraging Republican women candidates also, because women, we believe, tend to be more collaborative, whether they're in different parties or not. So in a way, I'd like to see that happen, but the numbers are not supporting that right now. So I think the midterm elections are going to be fascinating to watch, and I don't know if anyone has any predictions about the Pennsylvania race today. Mark, do you? No? No, we don't do predictions anymore.
Okay. And Gail, final word.
The last thing I'd say is just that I unfortunately feel more optimistic about women running for office in the US than I do in the UK right now, partially because I do think that there's been a little bit more of a fire lit under American women's behinds to get out there and run for office than here in the UK. That being said, I see there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of potential going on in more of the strategist circles to acknowledge the shortcomings that we have on reaching out to women, and that's the first step towards making some real gains.
Great. Thanks very much to Denise, Gail, and Anne.